graciously agreed to take questions during the talk. If you have a question or a comment, and just go down to the reactions button and push the raised hand if you have something you want to say. Welcome, everyone. I'm really excited about tonight, partly because I realized one of the most fun things about this job of setting up programming is I learned things about people that I never would have guessed. And Corinne, you're just a bunch of surprises, fascinating things. So I'm very excited to introduce our speaker, Corinne Blackmer, who's a professor at Southern Connecticut State University for many years. She teaches both English and Jewish studies there. She's a Californian native, born in Santa Monica, and went to UCLA. The most exciting thing I learned about you, Corinne, is that she served in the Sinai Front of the Yom Kippur War in 1973. I found that fascinating, and I can't believe that I've known you. I mean, I don't know you well, but I never knew that fact about you. She has written extensively on lots of subjects, Jewish, English literature, other things. The book that we're going to talk about tonight is, I think, your most recent book, called Poisoning the Wells, Antisemitism in Contemporary America. It's an anthology, and I think we're all really excited to hear what she has to say. And with that, I will say, Corinne, why don't you start and we'll take it away.
Thank you, Shoshana. That was a very lovely introduction. I hope I can live up to it this evening. I would like to begin with the events that took place in May 2021, because in my opinion, they were a watershed for the Jewish community in the United States and elsewhere. And that was during the Gazan War. There was an avalanche of hatred directed at our community, which reached new levels, and which we had not seen before. And the precedent, of course, was the Tree of Life, the Poway, and also the Monzi massacres. But the apex occurred during the Gazan War, where Jews were attacked in the streets, as we all know, in Los Angeles, in Chicago, and particularly in New York. I wrote an article. I was the co-editor of this volume with Andrew Pessin, and I wrote the introduction. I also wrote with a man named Joel Finkelstein an article, or chapter rather, excuse me, called Holocaust Denial on the Web, the new face of the world's oldest hatred. And in that piece, we talked about what the future of anti-Semitism would look like. And we did not know. I just talked to Joel the other day. Joel works for the FBI and for the Bureau of Homeland Security, and he tracks anti-Semitism, and he has been an extremely busy man. He works 14 hours a day, every day of the week except Shabbat. And he told me, amongst other things, developments that are going on, is how quickly anti-Semitism is becoming mainstreamed on the web. And that Holocaust denial is just one sort of continuum. And white nationalists and Islamists are making common cause. And they're showing specialization of tasks and behavior and cooperation. So that's one thing that's going on. So it's become a huge phenomenon, international phenomena. And it's very hard. One of the things that was difficult in this book is to delineate it happening in the borders of one country, i.e. the United States, because it's a worldwide phenomenon. We should be aware that it is very much a worldwide phenomenon, anti-Semitism now. Well, what's happened that has made anti-Semitism so incredibly bad? It's always been there, and it's my opinion, it's been a sort of an escalating chorus. It's been from the right, from people who, a man who undertook the, I'm sorry, Ronnie, are you finding internet connection going in and out? Is my internet connection going in and out? No, okay. Anyway, so can you all hear me well?
Yeah.
Okay, good.
No.
Great.
But I have and having it, so maybe they.
Okay. Anyway, so it's a worldwide phenomena, and it seems to be fueled in part by the money that Iran pours into the Palestinian propaganda machine. And I mention the internet because it's spread there very effectively, and it also spread institutionally. And I just want to, so that's part of the umbrella causes. People were at home during the pandemic and they put their heads inside of computers. And one of the things that happened to them is that they began to imbibe anti-Semitic theories and conspiracy theories, as Barry Weiss would say. Anti-Semitism is conspiracy theorizing. And they imbibed it there, and then they exported it elsewhere, from everything to left-wing institutions of higher learning, through religious organizations, through the internet, and then through right-wing white nationalists, Islamists, and other organizations on the right wing, QAnon, for example. So, and oftentimes these tropes, one of the interesting things about this is that they sounded all like one another. They were mouthing the same thing, these same conspiracy theories about Jewish people were on the left and on the right. And recently there was this rally that was held by neo-Nazis, at which Jewish Voices for Peace also showed up. So there is a certain convergence that's going on between the left and the right in terms of evocations of anti-Semitic animus. But it reached a crescendo with May 2021. There you had really egregious things beginning to happen, and a lot of violence and a lot of hatred. One of the interesting things, since I'm in higher education, was what would happen in higher education, where you had over 150 women's studies departments sign on to egregiously anti-Israel statements that covered everything from hiring people to promotion to writing letters of recommendation for students to refusing to publish Israel-related, pro-Israel-related work. And this was sweeping across universities and programs within universities. Now, it seemed to me when this was happening, I read many of these manifestos or anti-Israel statements that were promulgated by university programs or departments, and they were filled with a certain self-righteous glee and self-righteous indignation that was so extreme that the writers didn't have any idea of what they were doing. And so recently, HBCU, two conservative, very conservative HBCUs, historically Black colleges and universities in the South, are contemplating putting anti-gay language into their department platforms. So what you've gone from is, as usual, anti-Semitism is the canary in the coal mine. And once having decided to politicize departments and programs in this one particular way, there's no reason why you can't politicize them in other ways as well, to reflect anti-gay bias. Certainly you could exclude all Chinese scholars as guilty of the sins of their government. You could do all sorts of things that are happening currently with Jewish life in academia. Let me tell you a little story about the publication of this book, because it was published by IceGap, and it will be coming out in the second edition through Academic Studies. It is an extremely high quality volume, and it was originally received a contract with the University of Wisconsin Press. And what happened there is that the man who was the Raphael Kadishin, who was the original executive editor, left to take a job with Condé Nast in Jerusalem with his husband. And so it went into it came under the purview of another executive editor. And before he left, we did receive a contract, but the way the model they followed there was you signed the contract and then it went to the publication committee. And then it was published after that. So the readers' reports came back after we received the contract. And one reader said, oh, this is fine, this is great. Then they had two other readers who both cited that they could not publish this volume because it claimed, and they used that word claimed, that it was not only the right that promulgated anti-Semitism, but the left as well. And so therefore, its chances, it did not get published by University of Wisconsin Press. We withdrew it from publication and published it elsewhere. And I think I got lucky, and it will probably prove to be historically very lucky that my book on queering anti-Zionism, which is a critique of anti-Zionism amongst leading gay intellectuals, was lucky. It slipped in the door probably at the last moment. Wayne State University Press, who's not aware that this is not the cool kid thing to do anymore, to actually support Israel. And they were very, very enthusiastic about publishing this book. It's possible that Indiana University Press is also open. Otherwise, I will tell you quite frankly, university presses are closed to books that are pro-Israel. Or that allege that the left wing has anti-Semitic bias. And I just want to make a brief comment before I continue. Does anyone have any, and I want to let you feel free to interject, to make comments. I would prefer this to be a discussion and a conversation than anything else. If you have anything you'd like to say, we're all Jewish people here together. I'm sure we have a lot to say. But that is the story of the publication of the book. So the publication of the book is indeed part of the story of growing anti-Semitism in the United States. So does anyone have any? Yes, Jay.
Yeah, have you had any pushback from your institution, from Southern or from Brandeis?
No, Southern has been extremely supportive. We have study abroad programs both in Jerusalem and in the Negev with Ben-Gurion. We have a thriving Judaic studies program there that has a good endowment, actually, relative to Southern. It's not a wealthy university, obviously. And my colleagues are extremely supportive. What happens to me is they all know I'm writing on a controversial subject. People will quietly walk up to me and say, I agree with you. Thank you so much for being public about this. But I have not received any pushback. The woman who runs women's studies at Southern is a member of the National Association of Women's Studies. And they have signed on in 2016 to that very, very stridently anti-Israel platform piece, or just platform. And so they're probably the single entity in the university that's anti-Israel. And they also signed on to that statement about anti-Israel platform that came out in June, that they signed on to as a department. Yes, Dan?
Yeah, thank you for tonight's talk. One of the things that I hope you might speak a little bit about is your colleague, Andrew Pessin's experience and perspective that he brings to this. I was working for Connecticut College in part during a time where he was not on campus in the aftermath of some difficulties he experienced, and got to know him a bit when he returned to campus and we were looking for some funding of Jewish studies. But let me, to allow for more discussion, just make that point at this time.
Right. Let me talk briefly about my co-editor. I was on sabbatical, 7 years ago. And one of my colleagues, who was the former chair of Judaic Studies, Deborah Weiss, contacted me with an email and a link to Andrew, saying that he wanted some support because he had been the object of a terrible smear campaign at Connecticut College. What had happened specifically was that he had called people who supported Hamas in a particular way dogs, or Hamas he called them dogs, which I thought was very insulting to dogs. He was pilloried and was subjected to systematic shunning at his university. And he got a case of PTSD that was not inconsiderable. And he withdrew from the university for, I think, at least a year, perhaps a year and a half. It was written up in the Wall Street Journal and other more conservative venues that still care about anti-Semitism per se. And I reached out to him and I said, how are you doing? And he told me he was writing a volume on BDS, anti-BDS on the campus. And so I had an experience at Southern where I was the subject of a anti-Zionist and homophobic hate crime in 2008, which jibed with the Operation Hot Winter in the Gaza. And I used to wonder if the two incidents were connected. I no longer wonder. They were definitely connected. And there was a series of hate crimes that involved both death threats and also defacements of property. So we contacted, and I told him I had this experience, and he asked me if I would write something up for him. So I contributed to his volume that came out with Indiana University Press on the university and BDS. So that's how I know Andy, and he has been since that time a tireless fighter for Jewish people and Israel. That's my my co-editor. We had a sort of a division of labor over the book. I wrote the introduction and he did the editing on the volume. So we had this nice division of labor. So it was very good, which the volume has a wide variety of voices in it. Everything from anti-Semitism amongst Jewish American scholars to anti-Semitism on the web, to the return of Christian supersessionism amongst liberal Protestant denominations, and everywhere in between. Jewish Voices for Peace. I can just go through and this is the volume here, Poisoning the Wells, Anti-Semitism in Contemporary America. And anti-Zionism in liberal denominations, Christian Zionism, pink-washing anti-Zionism, the history of anti-Zionism and anti-Israel and anti-Semitism in the women's movement, intersectionality and the Jews, the rise of Black anti-Semitism, or I should say the reemergence of Black anti-Semitism, in part through organizations like Black Lives Matter, and micro boycotts, the whole phenomena of quietly being anti-Semitic, but it being very hard to ascertain what's really going on, like just quietly refusing to write letters of recommendation, for example, or doing other sort of subversive kinds of things. I see we have some comments in the chat. Let me just open that up briefly. Oh, okay, fine. That's not too. So I was going to, are you all familiar with Judith Butler? Yeah. So I was, she is a leading anti-Israel BDS activist. And I was going to give you, in case you hadn't been exposed to already, and if you haven't, and this is your first exposure, I'm sorry. So in advance, I'm going to apologize for what is about to happen. But here is an example of Judith Butler's prose. Let me, oops. It's here. So let me just, I will read this because what else can we do? This is Judith Butler's typical prose, and I'm mentioning this is because anti-Semitism amongst academics has developed an extreme obscurantism. And it's, I had to wade through it writing my book on queering anti-Zionism, where I took on Judith Butler, Sarah Schulman, Angela Davis, Jasper Puar, and Dean Spade. So here's Butler's typical prose. The move from a structuralist account in which capital is understood to structure social relations in relatively homologous ways to a view of hegemony in which power relations are subject to repetition, convergence, and rearticulation brought the question of temporality into the thinking of structure and marked a shift from a form of Althusserian theory that takes structural totalities as theoretical objects to one in which the insights into the contingent possibility of structure inaugurate a renewed conception of hegemony as bound up with contingent sites and strategies of rearticulation of power. So would anyone like to, I know people were raising their hands, so feel free, whoever raised your hands, to jump in. But before you do so, I just want to ask if anyone has an idea of what she just said. Rachel?
I have never had any idea what Judith Butler is talking about. I recall at one point she wrote an essay in the New York Times defending academic obscurantism as a way of keeping the plebes out of academia. So I've never respected her since. And I actually had to defend that position while defending my dissertation. So, you know, Judith Butler is dead to me. The reason that I had raised my hand was I just wanted to ask you to elaborate a little bit more on the possibility of there not being an American anti-Semitism, but of being multiple anti-Semitisms in the United States, because what you've described for the second half of your talk has been this very sort of anti-Israel, we can't actually touch Israel, so we're going to blame American Jews for Israel, a country in which we are not citizens and cannot vote, this sort of thing that happens in universities. But you started the talk by invoking the Pittsburgh and Poway massacres, which were perpetrated by white nationalists who probably couldn't give two shits about Israel, but say the Jews are not white and you know, we're going to go after them on racial grounds, which seemed to me to be two different types of anti-Semitism. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more sort of about the variety and the range, the options that Americans who wish to be anti-Semitic have in our culture.
Yeah, you can be, here's, I tried to suggest this maybe in the middle. There is a convergence increasingly between right-wing and left-wing anti-Semitism. They're not holding hands yet, but they're getting there. And I was talking about the recent rally in which the neo-Nazis and Jewish Voices for Peace both showed up. In terms of the varieties of anti-Semitism, there are several, and they're institutionally based, and partially they have a different agenda. White nationalists and Islamist anti-Semites, which can be, I guess, grouped on the right wing, have different agendas. Islamist anti-Semites are very anti-Israel as well, and believe that Israel is illegally occupying Muslim Holy Land. Right-wing white nationalists, anti-Semites, are essentially racist, but they're increasingly anti-Israel as well.
Do you think that there's any manifestation of anti-Semitism in the United States that exists sort of semi-independently of Israel? Or do you think that Israel is sort of at the heart of why we, again, not citizens of Israel, get shat on?
Okay, let me make a larger comment on what you've just said, Rachel. It doesn't seem to matter anymore to anti-Semites where individual Jews or groups of Jews stand in relationship to Israel. We are held responsible for Israel's quote unquote sins, regardless of where we might stand individually in relationship to the state of Israel. Anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism, the distinction between the two of them are collapsing as we speak.
All right, thank you.
So there's no way to make that distinction anymore. It's not viable. I can, let me, do we have another moment for a screen share of something else? Okay, let me screen share something else here. I did a little thing of this Holocaust analysis on the web, the future of the world's oldest hate. Just let me get this over here, excuse me. Need to push this down and do a slideshow so it's a little clearer. What's interesting about Holocaust analysis on the web, you think this was a typical, maybe archetypal right-wing trope. Deny the Holocaust. Actually, Judith Butler is getting there. She still thinks the Holocaust happened, but she doesn't think it matters, and she thinks it was exaggerated in historical time, that we're making too much of what happened in the Holocaust, and that the memory of the Holocaust needs to sort of be disavowed and disappear. So that here's the current situation with Holocaust denial. It is not radically set apart. It's a continuum of other forms of anti-Semitic passions and obsessions. It expresses virulent anti-Semitic resentment as manifested in conspiracy theories and victim competition, or the belief that our group is the true victim of oppression. And here it would be, the true victim of oppression would be the Islamists or the left-wing academics or in church organizations or others who think that the Holocaust happened, but who think it has been grossly exaggerated. And they're increasingly migrating over to this viewpoint on the web. And that they are being all victimized by Israel. And allow me to characterize the position of Jews in general and Israel in specific in the following way. They are scapegoat victimizers, or they're a scapegoat and they are a victimizer simultaneously. Now, Islamists and white nationalist groups are collaborating, dividing labor, and specializing on the web. And you wouldn't think they'd want to talk to one another because one is Muslim and the other is white Christian, but they are in fact collaborating fairly intensively on the web. And they're taking place for political organization against Jewish life. And this machinery on the web is responsive, very flexible, very adaptive, and it opportunistically adapts to world events, captures changes in resentment and recruitment. It can become a conduit to more effectively organize populist waves of global anti-Semitism. And I mention that because it would appear that as a trope, Holocaust denial on the web is like this extremely prevalent form of anti-Semitism. Particularly as you move further and further away from the Holocaust as an event, and the recent comments of someone like Judith Butler that there was always too much made of the Holocaust, and it was illegitimate as a cause for the founding of Israel. Anyone have any comments or questions you'd like to add? Because I'd love for this to be a conversation. Yes, Dan.
Picking up on an earlier comment you made about Black Lives Matter being a source of anti-Semitism, many know that it has some anti-Israel planks in it and chooses to see, I guess, international issues through a frame of domestic racism. Do you know, having done this work and studied in this area, do you have a prescription for those of us who are concerned about a systematic anti-Black racism in this country and are also concerned about anti-Semitism and want to work to advance a society that's, you know, moving racism out and anti-Semitism out, when, you know, a prominent group like that would be, you know, the most prominent group behind the country's, I think, most widespread organized protest movement in history, you know, unfortunately has taken some written positions that, you know, that advance anti-Israel in a way that many of us would view as anti-Semitic. So what does one do? If you have a view or a comment on that.
You are trying to be both anti-Semitic and anti-racist at the same time?
If one wishes to be,
I'm sorry, you're trying to oppose anti-Semitism and racism at the same time.
yes,
Okay. You will find yourself probably isolated, marginalized, and demoralized. Because the groups that, not everyone, not in every group, you will not find yourself isolated, demoralized, and marginalized. But certainly within Black Lives Matter. Now, having said that, there are personal exceptions. I've talked to some Black Lives Matter organizers who have said that Israel has nothing to do with their movement. I've talked to others that said that Israel is at the center of their movement, their fight against global racism, and that Israel is a racist country in extremis. Okay. And so what can you do? I want to follow Barry Weiss's advice here. I think that our institutions are collapsing. I really do. When you have departments who are willingly signing on to these radical anti-Israel statements, they have already participated in the total politicization of knowledge. And I'm waiting for what will happen when average Americans become aware of what is going on in these elite institutions, not only in the humanities or in philosophy or in history, maybe history is actually more immune in some ways, to be honest, but in STEM even, in medicine, a general collapse of evidentiary standards and standards of reason and fact. So to answer your question, it's very hard these days to fight anti-Semitism and to fight racism at the same time and find yourself in a robust community. So it's a tough situation. It's demoralizing, it's isolating, and it's a tough road to hoe. Yes, Rachel.
Okay, I won't disagree that that there were anti-Israel statements in an original platform of Black Lives Matter. And I don't disagree that there are some horrifying things that are happening as far as academic slights against all Israeli academicians and all that. But I just want to point out for the record that I attended on October 14th an online gathering by Surge, S-U-R-J, which is, what are they, standing, I should know what Surge stands for. Surge stands for Standing United for Racial Justice, I think is the acronym. Anyway, and I just want to say that it was totally devoted, that entire evening, that whole program was really devoted to educating everybody who was aboard that Zoom about how fighting anti-Semitism is part of fighting white supremacy. And it was a really inspirational and wonderful program of people of color, and Jewish people speaking and collaborating. And I found it very, I found it inspiring, and the flip side of the things that you're speaking of.
Absolutely, Rachel. I should have mentioned them, and they do some very, very good work. And there are still people who are doing very good work around seeing both these as forms of white supremacy. It's not as I would like to see it more common, but it's not that. But Rachel, you are absolutely right. Thank you very much. Anyone else with a comment or a question? Something I can field? Yes, Sarah.
You said Barry Weiss,
Yes.
Weiss?
Weiss, Barry, B-A-R-I.
Okay, I haven't heard of this person. You're talking a lot of this stuff that I don't.
Let me put it in the chat for you. She wrote a book called How to Fight Anti-Semitism, and she runs a podcast called Honestly. She used to work at the New York Times before she came to the conclusion that was no longer a viable thing to do. So she is, she would like to, what she sees is a sort of a widespread cowardice and a sort of a conformism that is ideological conformism. Of course, the right wing in this country has already totally collapsed. You either have to be for Donald Trump or you don't exist any longer. And then the whole problem with ideological conformism on the left is less so in the Democratic Party, fortunately, but certain positions are becoming quite hardened. Anti-Semitism just being one of them. And Jay, I don't know if you as a doctor are aware of some developments in medical schools, not around anti-Semitism, but other things.
Not so much, no, fill me in.
Well, it's not, I don't know if I want to go there because this is a focus on anti-Semitism, but I'm talking more about some things that should be of concern. One is the substitution of equality of opportunity for equality of outcome, which is, of course, targets both Jews and Asians as racial minorities. The other thing is, I can only call it the ideology of transgenderism, where it's now become, medical students will not refer to someone's biological sex, which strikes me as just plain dangerous and has resulted in some pretty scary stuff. I'm just trying to get everyone on board with sort of the extent to which, not where Rachel's talking about, there's still extremely good organizations that take this stuff on and are very rational. Look, I work at a rational institution where people take this stuff on all the time, and other organizations and places where they do. But it seems to me increasingly we are living in an ideologically driven sort of black and white environment. That's really quite extreme. And that does not support dissent or critical thinking or a plurality of points of view. Anyone else have some comment they'd like to make?
Yeah, I would like to just, I think what you just said about the black and white is so important. And as I'm sitting here, I'm, kind of biting my tongue and figuring out what I want to say and what I don't want to say. But one of my big things is this conversation has to be more nuanced.
Yes.
But unfortunately, a lot of people in the conversation cannot have a nuanced conversation, it seems. And this is true about so many things in our culture right now. Vaccinations, politics, everything. So, and this is a particularly complicated topic because we've got Israel and we have Judaism, and they're not the same thing. And so, Zionists, all of that. It's a much more complicated conversation. And if we can get away from the black and white and make it a more nuanced conversation, I do think that we can all learn and we can all, share what we know with others.
The truth is complicated. That's one of its things, that's nature. It's complicated, it's multifaceted, and what's happening, it seems to me, is that, if I have tons of people coming up to me constantly saying quietly, Corinne, I can't say this in public, but I just want to let you know, I agree with you, and thank you so much for saying this. And people are feeling silenced.
Mhm.
People are feeling shut down. People feel like they can't ask questions. They can't make objections. They are very concerned about that. And as I said earlier, and I will restate my conviction based upon all the research I've done on the internet and about institutions, regardless of how you feel about Israel, the distinction between Israel or anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism is in fact collapsing. Jews are held responsible for Israel, and they may dislike Israel assiduously, and still that is the case. Yes, Arthur.
Okay. I've been very involved in the situation I'm a co-chair of the Jewish Community Relations Council and the chair of a subcommittee called the Israel Committee. And as such, I've gotten involved with back and forths with any number of people, including Jewish Voices for Peace. Some of you might have seen my letters back and forth in the Register. And I got involved with a local minister, who had made several. I'm aware. I was at two talks that she sponsored, gave one and sponsored the other, that were basically very anti-Israel. And I confronted her vigorously, as is my wont. And somebody I know, who said she's a friend of this minister, said something that to defend that person. And I met with this person to discuss why I felt that way. And basically, I said a number of things, but what I pointed out, and what I also pointed out in a similar letter to the Yale Student Council and the dean and the president, none of whom responded.
Yeah.
Why? I said, Israel is not perfect. They have done things that I think are wrong. And so I don't believe that anti-Zionism that is anti-Semitism. You can be critical of Israel and not an anti-Semite. But then I go on to ask, why this focus on Israel to the exclusion of everything else? There's a church, UCC, I believe in Essex or Old Lyme, one out there somewhere, that has a monthly trash Israel day, like every month. And so my question was, where are they? Where anything else? Where are they with the China and the Uyghurs? Where are they with Myanmar and the Rohingya?
Where are they with Yemen?
Where are they with Darfur? Where are
Right.
they with Tigray? When the Darfur business exploded a few years ago, there was a huge rally in Washington, D.C., and Obama spoke to the rally, as a bunch of other people. And the Jewish Federation here chartered some buses. And we went to the churches and offered them to ride with us, no charge, for free. You know what the taking was? Taking was zero. Not one church sent a single person. So
Wow.
I say, how do you explain this focus? And I think the only explanation is there's a basic anti-Semitism. And as I pointed out to this person I was talking to, if you're a Christian, forget the Muslims right now, if you're a Christian, it's dogma. what is the dogma is that the Jews' punishment for killing Christ is that they will be for eternal wanderer. So here they see Israel, powerful little country, great economy. How can they accept that? It's contrary to their dogma. So I think, it's not so that anti-Semitism, and I think some of these people don't even realize they're being anti-Semitic.
Right.
It's unconscious, but it comes out as anti-Israelism. That's all I have to say.
Thank you, Arthur. I'm going to go back to answer your question or to make a comment on what you've said, which is extremely important. And I thank you very much for those comments. To something Shoshana had said earlier about complex thinking that I think is very important when examining sort of Christian views toward Israel or the Jewish people. And part of it is this very traditional sort of Jews killed Christ trope. But part of it is that Israel and Jews have become a political football in the fight between liberal Protestant denominations and right-wing Christian fundamentalist denominations in this country. Right-wing Christian fundamentalist denominations have a good deal of power, clout, politically and culturally. And liberal denominations are very upset by their diminishing power and clout. So they used to be extremely pro-Israel, these liberal denominations. And as the years have gone by and the decades have gone by, they have returned to supersessionism and extreme anti-Israel positions, in part because out of frustration, because their enemy, the real enemy is not the Jews or Israel, we're the political football, is the right-wing Christian fundamentalist organizations and churches in this country. So rather than attacking them directly or saying directly, I'm angry at you, they take it out on the Jews and return to Christian supersessionism and become anti-Israel. So there's a complex interplay of forces going on there. And Jews, again, I will say that my mantra is that Jews are the victimizing scapegoats of our era. And to your other point about why don't they concern themselves about Yemen, about Syria, about Darfur, part of it is this discourse. You all may have also heard of a thinker named Jasper Puar. And she's a very anti-Israel BDS supporter who is now a full professor of women's studies at Rutgers University. And she was one of the ones that made very fashionable Islamophobia and shut down possibilities of critiquing Islamic nations, as every time a Westerner or white person did so, they were either being Islamophobic or racist or imperialist. So the conversation got shut down, and many of these nations that are now the world's worst, some of the worst human rights abusers are unfortunately Islamic nations. So the conversation around those abuses has been muted. I have heard vociferous complaints about Israel, but absolutely nothing going on, what's going on in Yemen, or with the Uyghur Muslims, or with anything else that's going on that intersects with, or Syria, for that matter, anything else. Silence, radio silence on those issues, because it's Muslim nations who are involved, and the West has no right to critique them.
And in some cases, they're Muslims who are being persecuted, like the Rohingya and the Uyghurs. And
right.
Muslims, they won't even stand up for them because it doesn't fit their ideology.
Correct. It doesn't fit their ideology. And if you go to the Uyghur websites, you'll see they complain constantly about how, why are you so concerned about Israel? It's this relatively decent democratic nation, and you pay no attention to the fact that we are dying, that they are putting us in concentration camps, that they are destroying our language, our culture, our civilization, our memory, and our religion. You pay and killing us. You pay no attention to that. They will say that, those who are in exile. And they get no traction on the world stage because they're in the wrong place at the wrong time.
Correct.
And you may know, I mean, one of the things that's very curious is that Western news outlets have a huge number of reporters in Israel and practically no reporters anywhere else
Right.
in the Middle East. Part of that is out of fear and concern. Israel makes it very easy to report upon itself since it's engaged in an environment of relative transparency. Or good deal of transparency, and other nations are not and are very dangerous. So the news, I think journalism has failed pretty spectacularly. And it's failing along a number of parameters. And I feel for Barry Weiss having left. I understand why she left the New York Times. She couldn't really speak her piece there. But I really can recommend her podcast, Honestly, which is an excellent podcast that she does, series on everything from the extremes of transgender ideology through anti-Semitism, through the story of testosterone. She takes on all the hot topics and really approaches them in this very complex, nuanced, interesting fashion. And she does speak truth to power, and she gets some very, very good people there everywhere. So
I have a comment, if I can.
Sure, Cynthia.
I don't want to interrupt. Are you done? I didn't want to interrupt. Okay, so I have a question. First of all, I should be clear that I am fairly critical of a lot of what Israel does, and I find this, I agree with Shoshana that this is a nuanced discussion. But what interests me is the way in which so many politicians have identified Israel as a way to get the Jewish vote, which, doesn't seem to be, I mean, to me, that doesn't really make sense, because I think Jews are also interested in civil rights for everybody. Jews are interested in, a broad number of issues, capital punishment, all kinds of things. And I wonder in which that kind of assuming that the Jews only care about Israel when they vote, which may be true for some Jews, but I don't think it's true for everybody. It's a one issue thing. Has that contributed to this kind of conflating? Oh, if you're Jewish, then you have to only think about Israel. Do you have a thought about that?
Probably, although I think that horse is out of the gate. I think it's too late to recall that as a discourse or as a trope. I think that, as I've been saying from the beginning, all my research indicates to me that the alignment between anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism is now almost a complete fusion. Whether, and you can argue against it and say, look, I believe in anti-Semitism is a real problem, and I'm extremely critical or even reject the idea of Israel. And you can say that, but that is not how the anti-Semites and the anti-Zionists will respond to you. Unless you formally and completely renounce Israel, and by some groups, for example, Jewish Voices for Peace, you will be regarded as a good Jew, as they will call you right to your face and accept you within their group.
I don't think Jewish Voice for Peace completely rejects the existence of Israel. I could be wrong, but that's not my understanding.
My understanding is that is that they're fairly comprehensive in their rejection of Israel. They may want to go back to the 1917 borders. So, I mean, Jews could exist in Palestine.
Okay, I have to educate myself a little more here.
I can send you some things. Do you have my email?
Yeah, I do.
Okay, Great. And I will send you Miriam Ellman's chapter on Jewish Voices for Peace that appeared in Poisoning the Wells. Or you can just buy the book. It's in there. The kind of what is going on with Jewish Voices for Peace these days. It's changed a lot, Cynthia, over the last 10, 15 years. The organization has changed enormously. Anyone else have any comments or questions?
I think
I have a
Arthur
couple
has
of
something.
Additional comments.
Arthur, go ahead.
Yeah, first of all, in reference to Jewish Voices for Peace, I've unfortunately had a fair amount of interaction with them, and I assure you, they may have not written it down in any place, but they do not believe that the Jewish state should exist. I'm not saying that's everybody in Jewish Voices of Peace, but it's a heavily preponderant attitude. Not everybody in Jewish Voices of Peace, by the way, is Jewish. It's a subterfuge so that they can say, oh, we're not anti-Semites. After all, we're Jews. But the other thing I wanted to say is, just to give you an idea of the depth of all of what Corinne is saying, does anybody know how many times Israel has been condemned by the United Nations? I'll tell you, it's 200 times. Do you know how many times other countries have been condemned? Now, there are over 200 countries in the United Nations. Total, for all those countries, 6 times. Now, if Israel is 200 times worse than all the countries of the world combined, they shouldn't be allowed to exist. Does anybody believe? I mean, it just gives you an idea of the enormity of the problem. The enormity of the problem. Syria, Bashar Assad doesn't get condemned. China, of course, won't get condemned. Russia won't get condemned. They poison their politicians all the time. Myanmar doesn't get condemned. Nobody gets condemned.
They're too large to condemn.
I want you to go.
And China is too indispensable.
Hmm?
They're too large to condemn, and China is indispensable.
Right.
So China, everyone needs their products, and Saudi Arabia, people need the oil. And of course, Saudi Arabia is going to be in trouble over the next 20, 30, 40 years as we move away from oil. I don't know what their new shtick is going to be.
By the way, Saudi Arabia is the chair of the UN subcommission commission on women's rights.
I know.
How do you like that?
It's terribly ironic. I mean, you got to be kidding me.
So I have a question, which is, other than buying your book, what are some things that we can do to stem this tide that is clearly rising
Right.
Globally?
Yes.
And in America, of course.
Right. I think that one of the things you can do is that you can really educate your children well to be resistant to the anti-Semitism that is now rife in American college campuses, both private and the larger prestigious private and public universities in this country. And you can battle harden them to confront what they're going to confront and have the arguments required to battle against that. The other thing that I think that Jews should consider doing is creating some alternate institutions for ourselves. We're quite good at this in general, and maybe come together a little bit more and accept more of a plurality of Jewish voices in institutions that can engage in just what we're doing this evening, which is education. The third thing that we can do is we can sort of put our heads down and just keep on battling and riding through this. Eventually, my students always tell me to be calmed down because eventually lies expose themselves. I can only hope that that is true. And it won't be too late. I don't see pogroms and Holocausts returning, but I do see a lot of silencing, marginalization, and demoralization. And I think the way to fight that is to be vocal. I mean, I went up to my department chair the other day. This is not a hard thing to do at my institution. I said, look, I just want to let you know, like I let everyone know, that I personally, this is me personally, am pro-Zionist. And I said, I'm critical of the policies of the Israeli government, and I would like to see it, and I believe in a two-state solution. He said, oh, okay, Corinne, sure. And I guess he was a little bit shocked to hear this. You know, out of the middle, somewhat out of the middle of nowhere. It wasn't like going into his office and saying, oh, by the way, I'm a lesbian, which would have, you know, been, okay, I know that already. It's much harder to be Zionist on American university campuses, certainly, than it is to be gay or lesbian. So I think that those are some of the things that we can do: educational outreach, and getting together with one another, and also arming our children to understand what they're going to have to confront when they go to, particularly to prestigious colleges across this country.
Thank you very much. I also want to say I really appreciate how everybody handled themselves tonight. This is a really tough topic,
Yeah.
I think. And, you know, I always get nervous when we have anybody talk about anything that has to do with anti-Semitism or Israel, because it does bring up a lot of passions. And I'm really impressed with the questions and the responses and the eager listening that I've seen. So everybody should give themselves a round of applause. Is there anyone else who wants to ask a question, make a comment before I start talking about upcoming events?
I just want to say really briefly, thank you so much, Corinne. Like, this was fantastic, and it's like interesting and relevant and meaningful. And I just got my booster like an hour and a half ago. So I think otherwise I would have something more sort of sophisticated to say, hopefully. But thank you so much for teaching tonight. It's fantastic.
Thank you, Rabbi Woodward. I really appreciate being here. And thank you all for modeling civil conversation and civil possible disagreements across many different parameters. I have some fairly complex views of these matters, but I also have to speak to what the rhetorical realities are out there.
Great.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you so much.
You are so welcome. Thank you all for coming. I really appreciate.
And next week we have Max Duboff is going to be speaking about 17th century Christian Kabbalists, if you can believe that. When he told me about that, I had to do a little bit of research to see what that even was. There are some very particular prominent individuals who were very interested in the Kabbalah in the 17th century. So that should be fascinating. Next week, 7:30 on Wednesday. And thank you again, Corinne. We're going to try to make sure we have some of your books in the gift shop and at our book fair, which is going to be on November 21st, Sunday morning. And Mark Oppenheimer will be there talking about his new book about Squirrel Hill. So I hope everybody can come to that as well.
Thank you all very much. Have a wonderful evening.
All right.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.